All right, so welcome back to another midweek with Double Creek. Today we are in week 23 out of 52 in our 52 weeks with Jesus from the book by James Merritt. After today, it's just 3 more weeks, and we're going to be halfway through this whole 52 weeks. So today we're still in section 4. This is the 5th week of section 4. There are 12 weeks in this section. If you remember, this section is called Jesus the Storyteller. And so each week during this section, we are looking at a particular story or parable that was told by Jesus. And we've seen some great ones, some fascinating ones already. And let me just say that they're all pretty fascinating. And we're going to see this as we continue on. But the title of today's lesson is this: A Better Financial Planner. Now, let me just say before we get into this today that sometimes we try to figure out which parable it is we're talking about, but we are not talking about someone who couldn't control their money here. This parable that we're looking at today has more to do with how they looked at their possessions, how they treated their possessions. So knowing that, knowing the title of this lesson, A Better Financial Planner, which parable of Jesus might we be looking at today? Well, today we are looking at the parable from Luke chapter 12, verses 13 through 21, that is known as the parable of the rich fool. It's a parable about a man. We'll read it here in just a few seconds. Parable about a man who's very wealthy when it comes to worldly wealth, riches and possessions in that way, but he just didn't understand really what good he could do with all that wealth that he had. And so with that being said, let's go ahead and read this parable and see what Jesus had to say in Luke chapter 12. It says, someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to him, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." And he told them a parable, saying, the land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, "What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops." And he said, "I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and all my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample good laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry." But God said to him, "Fool, this night your soul is required of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." So, as you can see here, I think this is a pretty simple parable for us to understand. There are a couple of main points that are in this parable. The first one being that we're not to devote our lives. We're not to devote our lives to the gathering and accumulation of wealth. Now, that doesn't mean we cannot have nice things, and it doesn't mean we can't have many things. It really comes down to what we do with all of the wealth, all the things that we have, all the blessings really that come from God. Because what happens to all that we gain, all that we earn in life when we die? Well, it typically gets passed down to someone, sometimes to someone who doesn't appreciate the hard work, the struggles that it took to really gain all of that stuff. One of the ladies here at our church and I, we were talking the other night at Trail Life about how she was reading the book of Ecclesiastes with one of her friends. And she talked about how that book talks about how everything is just meaningless. But when you think about it, the author of Ecclesiastes was King Solomon, maybe the wealthiest man to ever live. And he's saying that everything is meaningless. But you think about him, maybe the wealthiest man to ever live. He's writing this book as he's old in age, he's late in life, and he's realizing just how meaningless life and the things of life can be if we don't do things the right way. He had come to understand, like the rich fool in this parable that Jesus was talking about, that possessions and wealth they're not important in the end, are they? It becomes meaningless for us and for our eternity. How much possessions, how much wealth we have here on this earth. Now, the second main point in this parable is that we are not blessed by God to hoard our wealth to ourselves. So, simply, God blesses us in a lot of different ways, doesn't He? It can be financially, it can be with nice things, or it can be with something else. But what matters is that we don't just hoard it, we just don't hold on to it so that that wealth is only used for ourselves. That's easy to do. But God blesses us so that we can in turn bless others. So let's just remember these couple of main points about this parable as we go through our time together here in week 23. Well, in this book that Merritt's writing, he opens up this chapter with this question. How do you see your wealth? And I think that's a really good question. Because really, what is wealth? How would you define wealth? Well, when I just looked up wealth, I Googled it, the meaning of wealth, the first definition I got was this: an abundance of valuable possessions or money. Now, is anybody listening to this surprised that this definition came up first? It certainly doesn't surprise me. In fact, when I just searched Google for the wealthiest people on earth, you know what came up? A lot of people on earth who are the richest, who are worth the most when it comes to value of money, in terms of value of money. And who do you think topped that list as of last month? Apparently, Elon Musk topped the list as far as having a net worth of $241 billion. Now, that's just crazy to even think about to me. Then there was Jeff Bezos at $151 billion of net worth. Bezos is the founder of Amazon. He started Amazon from his garage, and now he's worth $151 billion. Talk about a rags to riches story there. But I think that's typical of how wealth is viewed in our society, in our world. Not just in America, but in our world. Wealth, according to our world, comes down to how much you are worth in dollars as a human being. How much money you have, how many possessions you have. That's what wealth comes down to. Do you have an abundance of valuable possessions or money? Well, if I started off today by telling you that today's lesson and our time today is going to be geared toward the rich, some of us here might be turned off immediately. Our minds might think instead to somebody else that we know. Or maybe you immediately start thinking about someone that you think this could be geared to. You know, a retired person who has become a millionaire. Not all retired people become millionaires, but you maybe think about a retired person who's become a millionaire. Maybe you think about someone who has won the lottery, or some athlete who is very famous, or some young person who just made all the right moves at a very young age and is now worth millions of money when it comes to value that way. But we are richer than we think, aren't we? And I'm not just talking about as Christians. As Americans, typically, we are richer than we think. Merritt points out that the median income in the U.S. when he wrote this book is $50,064. Now, that number fluctuates. It goes up and down based on what's going on in the world, how much people are getting paid, based on things like that. So, for what it's worth, that number of $50,064 of a median income for a family, it fluctuates. But if that number is accurate, or somewhere in that ballpark, it means that if your household is making somewhere close to that, that you are inside the top 1% of the richest people in the world. Hard to imagine, isn't it? But when you go outside of the U.S., especially to third world countries, you realize outside the U.S. many people are struggling, don't they? Merritt also points out that if you make just $15,000 to $20,000 a year, which is hardly enough to cover rent, clothes, food, vehicle, things like that, and other necessary things, even if you made just $15,000 to $20,000, you'd still be in the top 12.2% of richest people in the world. Merritt says we basically need three things to survive. He says food, shelter, and clothing. Well, there are some tribes out there who have survived for many, many years without clothing. I've watched a lot of survival shows over the years. Me and my wife Terry both have. We love watching survival shows. And there are a few things that people who are put in a survival situation, there are a few things that they try to do as quickly as possible on that first day or the second. They try to find a place where there's food, where they can maybe have food, where they can have a good place for a shelter, where they can get a fire going. But mainly they look for a place where they can find water. The reason is this: at least 60% of the body is made of water. Now, a human can go without food for about 3 weeks, up to around 21 days or so. But typically, we could only last 3 to 4 days in normal situations without water. So water is needed well before food. Of course, we want food, so we want to be in an area where there is some food, but water has to come first. Then a shelter is needed if you're in a survival situation. Something to keep you dry, maybe to help keep you warm. And then a fire is also needed. You think about us here in our world. We have it made here. We drink water out of the sink, perfectly fine. Some people don't like the taste of it, but it's healthy. I mean, it's not going to hurt you. We drink water from our refrigerators. We have bottled water. But water in creeks, rivers, ponds, and places like that, they can be contaminated with different things. And so to make sure that water is safe in a survival situation, it should be boiled first, unless it's a stream coming fresh out of the mountains. But it should be boiled first to get rid of any possible disease-carrying germs, or that things could be including viruses, bacteria, or parasites. Now, if you don't kill those things, if you don't boil that water and things like that, people can get sick. It doesn't mean you're going to, but if there are any parasites there, you can get sick. If you just go to Mexico, you don't even have to be in a survival situation, but if you just drink their water straight from the sink, it's most likely going to mess your stomach up. So in a survival situation, fire is needed to boil that water, and a fire is also going to be needed to cook anything that you might catch or kill so that you can eat. Those are things that are typically needed for survival, like water, shelter, fire, food. But Merritt points out that everything else we have in life outside of those things could just be considered as wealth. So think about the things that we have outside of those survival items that could be considered as wealth, or things that we have that just are not necessarily necessary. We have closets full of clothes, don't we? And full of shoes. Now, we've collected here for Trail Life at our church here in just the past couple of months several bags of shoes to be donated for Trail Life to be sent off. It's a fundraiser that we do. At homes, we have our attics, don't we? And what do we use our attic space for typically? Well, if you're like most people, you use the attic to store things. Maybe it's decorations for holidays or other events. Or maybe it's just putting something in your attic that you used for children and you don't have babies around anymore, but you just want to keep it around, so you put it in the attic. We also have garages. Now, garages are a place where we can park our vehicles, right? But for many, the garage is no longer a place where they park their vehicles. Instead, the garage has become just another place where we store things or where we hoard things that we don't use that often. And how far do you have to travel? Think about this. How far do you have to travel when you're going anywhere really before you see a fenced-in area with metal doors where we can store more stuff? Storage buildings, where we pay monthly rent for someone else just to hold on to our stuff for us. Now, if these things we store are going to be used, that's one thing. But for many, when we store these things up in the attic or in the garage, in the corners, or up high, or in a storage building, for many people, when we store these things somewhere, they just sit there. That's what we do really with much of our wealth in today's world, don't we? And Merritt says something here that really hits home. He says, the way you see your wealth determines your spiritual health. Now, I really love that statement right there. The way you see your wealth determines your spiritual health. Because it really says a lot to us. If the wealth we have is just used to kind of sit around, those extra things we use are just to sit around and they don't serve a real purpose, we don't really use them, what good is it, right? And then on the other hand, if our spiritual wealth like that is just, we're just content with it, we're just fine with where we are and we're not using it the way we should to, what good is that? So how do we see our wealth, both physically and spiritually? Because Merritt points out something to us that is called secret wanting. Merritt mentions that one of the most fascinating biographies he ever read was a biography about John D. Rockefeller. And at the turn of the 20th century, so over 100 years ago, he was, I guess, the one and only billionaire in the world. He owned, at the time, Standard Oil, which at that time was the only major oil refinery in the entire world. And so someone asked him once, how much money is enough? And you know what his answer was? He replied and just said, just a little more. Just a little more. John D. Rockefeller, he had what you could say is a problem with covetousness. Covetousness. It's basically a desire for worldly gain. It's like a disease. It's something that it's like it's contagious and it's easily caught. But the root of coveting, the root of covetousness, and being someone who covets, the root of that is one word: more. It comes from us wanting more and more for ourselves, doesn't it? The greatest cause of obesity in the world is that people want to eat more. They want more. The top cause for financial problems is spending more than what we bring in, more than what we have. Covetousness. It's said to be the one sin that you can easily hide if you really want to. Now, it's always been a struggle. It's so important that God included coveting into one of the 10 commandments in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 17. God said, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. See, we live in a world where we just want more and more, don't we? The rich man in this parable that Jesus is talking about in Luke chapter 12, he was already a rich man. He had everything he needed in life and much more. But he wanted more than that. He wanted more than what he already had. What he had just wasn't good enough for him. So we have to learn to be content with what you have. We can read in the first verse of Luke chapter 12 that thousands of people had gathered to hear Jesus. And then down in the 13th verse, when this parable starts, it says one of them spoke to him. That's what prompted Jesus to tell this parable. Because there was one man who was listening in this crowd of thousands who wanted Jesus to have tell his brother to divide the inheritance with him. He wanted to make sure he got his. So Jesus tells this parable. And he begins by telling him, listen, you need to be on your guard. And everyone who was listening, be on your guard against all kinds of covetousness. He begins by talking about a man who is both rich and a fool. Now, he wasn't a fool because he was rich. He wasn't a fool because he was prosperous, because he was successful. Nowhere in the Bible does God condemn well-earned, well-deserved financial prosperity. God blessed many people who became rich in the Bible. So, this isn't a parable saying we cannot be rich or we cannot be wealthy financially or even with some possessions. No, this man became a fool because he didn't understand one thing, where his wealth came from. In his mind, all of this wealth came from him. He would be one of those people who said, I worked for it, I earned it, I plowed it, I planted it, I took care of everything, and I made it grow. And while he did do those things, Jesus helps us understand how he really became rich. Because Jesus points out in the 16th verse that I read earlier that this man's land produced plentifully. Jesus didn't talk about how hard the man worked to become rich. Jesus points out that this man became rich because his land produced for him. In other words, God was providing this farmer, this rich man, with everything he needed. God had given him this land. God sent the rain that was needed for the crops. God brought the sun when it was needed. God provided everything that was needed for this land to be productive. So through all of this, the man became rich because of everything that God had blessed him with. But the rich man was a fool because he saw all that he had as only his, rather than seeing it as coming from God and being blessed by God. See, it was foolish thinking when you get down to it. This man was blind as to everything that was going on around him. He couldn't see the God who gave him his wealth. And he also couldn't see around him to see what type of other people he could help with that wealth. He had become selfish. He was overcome with this desire to just have more and more and more stuff. He was caught up in a lifestyle, you could say, of covetousness. What was it this man said? He realized that he had no more room to store the crops that he had. So he didn't just stop with that. He said, what I'll do is this. I'll just tear down my barns, the barns he was using, and he says, and I'll just instead build larger barns. Now there in these larger barns, he would just be able to store everything that he had in there. He realized then that he could be able to just have stuff stored up for years. He could sit back, relax, eat, drink, and be merry. And then for the first, and I think the only time in one of the parables of Jesus, God comes to talk to this man. And God said, fool, this night your soul is required of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? This man felt that he had everything he needed. He also thought he had many years left of life, but God points out to him and lets him know that you don't even have another day. So all this stuff that you have, what's going to happen to it? Whose will it be? It's very similar to what James talks about in his letter in James chapter 4, in verse 14, where James said, what is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Think about a mist. Some versions use the word vapor. A mist or a vapor is there for just a short time and then it's gone. That's what we are. We're here on this earth for a short time. And then just like that, we are gone. Considering all the years that have already come and gone, the years yet to come, and eternity, we are just a short little blimp right there, a short little spot. And everything we collect up to that point in life where we are taken from this earth, where we die, everything that we have collected becomes meaningless to us. Jesus is making the point here that this rich man in this parable was foolish for a few reasons. One being that he thought he was the owner and that he was the sole reason for everything that he had in life. Two, he also thought he could just keep it all. But he couldn't. As God says, what's going to happen when you die? And then 3, he wasn't thinking anything at all about how meaningless this type of wealth was for him when he dies. And then Merritt closes out this chapter by showing us that we have to be conscious of where we are going. Most people look at all their possessions, all their money, as being just what they have for them. And yes, we can use our money and our possessions for ourselves. We can use all that we have just for ourselves, but it's not the way God wants us to use what He has blessed us with. When we understand that, when we understand that all we have comes from God, and that all we have really belongs to God, since He is the giver of all things, it'll change the way we think about our finances, both as individuals and as the church. Covetousness, it's a sin. It's that sin of wanting more and more and more. You remember the story of Achan from Joshua chapter 6 and 7? In Joshua, God is leading the Israelites through that promised land, into that promised land finally. The first city that they come to where they have to take over is Jericho, a very fortified city, a powerful city. And God hands that city over to them in a rout. But there were certain things that they were to follow, weren't there? There were certain items, certain things from this city that they were not allowed to take, that they were not allowed to keep for themselves, no matter how much they would want it. They were to destroy this city. But Achan took what he wasn't allowed to. In Joshua chapter 7, verses 20 and 21, it says this, "And Achan answered Joshua, 'Truly I have sinned against the Lord God of Israel. And this is what I did. When I saw among the spoil a beautiful cloak from Shinar, and 200 shekels of silver, and a bar of gold weighing 50 shekels. Then I coveted them and took them. And see, they are hidden in the earth inside my tent with the silver underneath.'" Achan was stoned, lost his life for on that day for the sin of disobeying God. But it all started with, as he said right there in these verses, where he coveted them and he took them. The message of this parable is that our lives shouldn't be consumed with wanting more and more just to have it for ourselves. God wants us to use what we have, what He has blessed us with, to benefit others, to benefit His kingdom. We can be like Achan. We can want more for ourselves. We can be like this rich man in this parable and want more for ourselves. But Jesus makes it clear in this parable that we have what we have because of God's blessings. It belongs to God. So make sure we honor God with it. That's kind of the whole point of this parable. God's not saying people can't be wealthy in some way. Many people have been wealthy who are Christians over the years. But it's what we do with that wealth, how we use it to help build His kingdom. Hope you've enjoyed our time together for Midweek this week. We look forward to the next, we're almost halfway through the second half really of this 52 weeks with Jesus as we get there. Thanks for joining us. Have a great day and God bless.